Hello, Dr. Ken here with a lecture on the rise of the Republic and the wars with Carthage. This is from my Roman history module, who will have access to the notes and slides. Of course, not everyone else will, but anyone who wishes may certainly watch this if they find it interesting. And I'm going to go through, as I say, the conflict of the orders in the early Roman Republic, and then talk about the Punic Wars with Carthage, which are what propel Rome to its status as an empire. And as my Roman history class will have seen, the early Republic in that time, around 500, 510 or so BC rather, the patricians and plebeians had united in their efforts to get rid of the kings of Rome. But once that was over, the chief sort of fruits of that victory went to the patricians, the elites, the aristocrats of Rome. And there were a number of restrictions imposed or present in the Republic, whereby the high offices of state, and indeed to sit in the Senate, could only be undertaken by members of the patrician order. So this was a problem, and there's more to it than that. It's along the lines of the two orders, patrician and plebeian, and of course there are wealthy plebeians, as wealthy as there are patricians, but there's also a disparity of wealth by and large, whereby the patricians tend to be richer than the plebeians on the whole. And the patricians mostly lived in the city and had their properties protected by the city walls, whereas the plebeians often lived and worked in the countryside in their small holdings. The patricians also had large farms in the countryside as well, and would get more. It was also the plebeians, the land-holding ones, who served in the army. And when they had to go off and fight, their little farms would be neglected. They could be subject to all sorts of predation, and might get lost along the way, thus reducing them in status. There was also the unjust law of debt. And I've mentioned this before to my class, but it essentially said that if a plebeian was in debt and couldn't repay that debt, and their body became the surety of the debt, and they could be sold into slavery. Interestingly, it didn't seem to apply to patricians if they were in debt, though they seem to have perhaps rarely been. There's also and this was a source of great grievance, as you can imagine, between the orders. There was also an unequal distribution of public land. So as Rome expands into Italy and takes over new territory, the agere publicus, it's called, public land, a lot of it is acquired in conquest. It's meant to be distributed more or less equally to the Roman citizens, but in actual fact it isn't. It goes to patricians, and sometimes they occupy this land illegally, but then are able to hold on to it long enough that it essentially is theirs, or it's treated as theirs. So around 494 BC, the plebeians appear to have had enough, and there was no legal way for them to redress their wrongs, the wrongs committed against them, because the law served the patricians and it didn't serve them. So they took the matter into their own hands and went on strike. We call this the succession of the plebs. They went to Mons Sacer, the sacred mountain outside the city, the hill just beyond the Anio, and said, right, we're going to leave. You patricians can fight your wars for yourselves from now on. And it worked. It got them some concessions, not all the concessions they wanted, but it gets the creation of a new office of state called the Tribune of the Plebs, or the Tribunes of the people, and these would be the numbers change over time, but initially two, who are chosen from among the plebeians by themselves, so they vote for them, and they were given the power of veto, to forbid the acts of the other magistrates, which were thought to be bearing unjustly upon any citizen. and the tribune's power, or the tribune's person, was made inviolable, meaning it was illegal for anyone to attack a tribune while in office. They could not be arrested either, or interfered with in the lawful exercising of their duties. They could be held to account after their office was finished, and this is true of all Roman state offices, especially those that provide immunity from prosecution. If once the offices are ended, they could be certainly prosecuted if they've done wrong. The tribunes were assisted by two aedles, so lesser magistrates chosen from the plebeian body. And the unofficial meetings of the plebeians, where they'd gone on strike, later became an official assembly known as the Plebeian Assembly. And it becomes a permanent assembly thereafter, the Concilium Plebis, or Concilium Plebis, assembly of the plebs, and or for the plebs. And the assembly could also pass or at least from about 492 onwards, they could pass what was called a plebiscite, which was binding upon the plebeians, but not on the whole of the citizen body, namely the patricians, as yet. In time it would be, but at this point it wasn't. So they got some concessions, and what's beginning to happen in Rome is the formation of two kind of factions, not exactly political parties, but like political parties, called optimates and populares. And the optimates are those who represent the traditional power of the aristocrats, the Senate, the patricians, that sort of thing, more conservative hardliners we might call them. And the populares are politicians who support the common people, the plebs in particular. Now, of course, it's not always the case that a plebeian is involved in the populares faction. Quite a few patricians get involved in that as well, and some plebeians even go over to the side of the optimates faction. So it's not as straightforward as along class divisions, but it's as I say, the closest thing they had to political parties, although there were other factions as well, often family-based factions within the ruling elite. Anyway, so there are politicians who come along who try to redress some of the grievances that people have had. One is a man named Spurius Cassius, who tries to redistribute the ager publicus, the public land that's been illegally seized by mainly patricians. He's a consul, he's in the highest office of the state, and he attempts to pass an agrarian law that will reform the division of public land. However, when the law is brought forward, the patricians use their influence to prevent it from passing. And after his year of office had expired, Spurius Cassius was charged with treason, and the attempt to make himself a king. This is a kind of trumped up charge, and it'll happen. This won't be the last time as well this happens. And he's tried, condemned, scourged, and beheaded. And this is a kind of fight back on the part of the patricians, because they control the courts for the most part at this point, and can use that to their advantage. The conflict of the orders had been going on for about 50 years, and in 462 BC we get a man named Terentilius Harsa, who tries to institute some further reforms. He wants to, well, the hope is to make the plebeians equal before the law as the patricians, and Harsa proposes a commission to gather up the law, to publish it, and make it readily available. And this is seen as another further concession to the plebs. And he's also trying to give up some of the public land, so another land reform law under Harsa on the Aventine Hill. But the concessions don't really go quite far enough. It doesn't satisfy the plebs, and it was finally agreed the commission of 10 men, the Decemvirs, and we've heard of these from Livy before, are then appointed to draw up the law and they should be published and binding on plebeians and patricians alike. And what's of course the case prior to this is that the laws are not written down; they're kept by patricians in their heads only, apparently, and they're the only ones who know them. So it gives them a monopoly over the exercise of law. So it's decided that a compromise should be reached and the laws should be published. And we're told that the commission is sent off to Greece to study their laws. Pardon me, I've written an article on this. I'll shamelessly promote it here. It's in the Athens Journal of History about whether or not this actually happened. And the fact is we don't know whether it happened. There's no evidence, no definitive evidence that it did, apart from the sources saying that it did, and mainly just Livy. But it is the sort of thing that states did when they were making major, reformations to their constitutions. So it's entirely possible that it could have happened. So the Decemvirate, around 450 BC, of the Board of 10, they enter upon the task of writing down the laws, and presumably they're not just writing them down. They're probably having to think about phrasing them for the first time in a kind of permanent way. So it's really writing up the laws for the first time in their history. And they produce the 12 tables, or actually they produce 10 of the 12 tables. And the old law of debt is still there. It is not gotten rid of, which was a major concern for the plebeians. But the tables were quite important because they are, for the first time, the laws are written down and they're seen to apply to everyone equally, even though they still favor the patricians. It's seen that the work is not quite done, so another Decemvirate is adjourned, or not adjourned, but established. And this comes under the leadership of a man named Appius Claudius, and we've encountered his story before in Livy. He doesn't want to give up the power that he's got, because when the Decemvirate is in charge, all the normal offices of state and assemblies are suspended. The Decemvirate rules, like an oligarchy with supreme power. And surprise, surprise, their president doesn't want to give up his authority. And this leads to the tragic death of Virginia, a free woman whom Appius claims is his slave, and her father, according to the story, according to tradition at any rate, kills her rather than hand her over to Appius Claudius. This leads to the second succession of the plebs, so they go on strike again. And the upshot is that the Decemvirate is disestablished, and the old government is restored. Consuls are elected, and there's again, but the laws have been published. The 12 tables have been published at this point, and there's a sense that there's still a need of reform. So we get the Valerio Horatian laws of 448 BC, which grant some further rights to the plebs. So one had to do with the right of appeal to the people, and the right of the tribunes to be sacredly protected in the exercise of their duties. So these two rights are now solemnly reaffirmed, that the people can appeal decisions made by aristocratic magistrates to courts of their peers, as it were, and the assembly of the plebs is now given the power to make laws binding upon the whole people. And this is in many ways considered a second charter of Roman liberty. If the first was after the first succession of the plebs. And then over time, then from that period, from about 450 onwards, there are further concessions, and the plebs are getting additional rights. So in 445, they have the right of intermarriage. They can now marry into the patricians and vice versa, which they weren't allowed to do beforehand, which assured their social and civil equality, and paved the way for their political equality as well, which they still didn't quite have. So what they gain is, in terms of rights of citizenship, as I say, public rights, private rights, the rights of holding office, although not all the offices are open to them at this point, and the right of intermarriage. But the right of holding public office, or the higher offices at any rate, that's still denied to them, and it's a subject of concern. And so it's clear that there's a grievance, an inequality that needs to be addressed, and an attempt is made to solve the problem in 444 BC by introducing military tribunes with consular power, which plebeians are then allowed to hold those positions for. So these new officers they're a bit like consuls, and they could be elected from either patricians or plebeians. They were called military tribunes with consular power, elected by the Comitia Centuriata, that is the assembly of the army, which was one of the three assemblies, and the assembly of the army was stacked in such a way that the aristocrats always controlled the outcome. And so in practice, these military tribunes with consular power are either few and far between, because apparently it's up to that assembly to decide when they're going to be, when they're going to happen, when these offices will exist or not. And so it's not really a solution. It means that, again, the patricians can kind of control more or less who's going to be in the high offices of state. But again, it's clear that grievances need to be addressed. So a new office is created in 443 BC, and that's the censorship. And we'll recall from the life of Cato the Elder that he was censor at one point. And it transfers some of the power of the two consuls to this other elected position. The censors were to draw up the census, that is, to make the estimate of every person's property, to assign them then to their appropriate class, which includes who sits in the Senate, and whether they belong to the equites, the knights, or the common people, or the Senate, etc. And the patricians agree there should be two new quaestors. Quaestors are like treasurers, officers in charge of money, again elected, and these two new ones were to be elected from the plebeians. So steadily, gradually, the plebeians are gaining rights and privileges over time. Along comes another reformer named Spurius Milius, and he comes around when a famine is raging in Rome. And Milius, apparently many poor citizens committed suicide because they couldn't afford to feed themselves. He purchases grain at his own expense and distributes it to the poor, which won in the hearts of many people. However, again, the aristocrats are concerned, or they claim they're concerned that Milius is trying to set himself up as a king, so they demand a dictator to be brought in to get rid of him, and he ends up being publicly stabbed in the heart. We don't have all the details of this. And we don't know exactly what entirely was going on here, but it sounds like they were afraid Spurius Milius was a threat. Whether he was actually trying to set himself up as a king or not, I can't say, but he was removed, as the other chap we heard about earlier was also removed. But as I say, plebeians and patricians are becoming more and more equal. They are essentially able to run for the same offices, and will be able to in time occupy the same offices. Then we come to the war with the Gauls and the capture of Veii. Veii is the largest city of the Etruscan League. It's besieged by Rome from 405 to 396. And because the people of Veii weren't disposed to meet the Romans in the open field, so they go behind their walls, and eventually the Romans are able to defeat them. They capture Veii, led by Camillus, who was appointed dictator at the time. Dictators are appointed in times of crisis for a fixed term only. Camillus captures Veii and was given a splendid triumph for it, but around the same time, though, of one of their greatest victories comes one of their greatest disasters, and this has to do with the Gauls sacking Rome. And remember, the Gauls occupied northern Italy, or what's today northern Italy, and possibly the Etruscans had been keeping them occupied, but since the Etruscans had to fight the Romans, nobody was keeping the Gauls in check, so they come down, entered and plundered and burned the city, with only the Capitoline Hill essentially remaining intact. And that's because the sacred geese of Juno supposedly warned the people that the Gauls were coming. And again, Marcus Furius Camillus enters into the fray. He had been triumphed 4 times, 5 times dictator, honored with the title of second founder of Rome. He either defeats it's not clear what exactly happens between Camillus and the Gauls. He's either defeated them or he's bribed them. As I say, it's not entirely clear. But anyway, the Gauls are, for the time being, dealt with in one form or another. But the city of Rome itself is in such a state, many people are saying, well, let's abandon it and go off and live in Veii, this new town of the Etruscans, the big city of the Etruscans that we've captured. Again, according to Livy, there was a kind of miraculous moment when they're debating this in the Senate, and a troop of Roman soldiers marches up, and their commander calls to a halt and says, "Here we remain." And this was heard inside the Senate house, and it was taken as an omen that they should remain in the city of Rome and rebuild it. So they do, with Camillus's leadership in no small part, and so sometimes he's called a second founder of Rome. It becomes clear that the power of Rome depends on the union of her people. That harmony and not discord was the source of her strength. So again, there are further attempts made to unify the different peoples. We get a man named Manlius, who had been a defender of the capital during the Gaulish conflict. He wants to loan people money without interest, and prevent them from being imprisoned should they get into debt. But he's then seen as a social agitator, charged with conspiracy, and then condemned to death. So again, like some of the other reformers, or apparently reformers, that we saw earlier, he's dealt with rather harshly by the elites, well, primarily the patricians. But then, reform still continues apace. There are the Lakinian Laws of 376 BC, which were adapted a more effective way, I suppose, of dealing with these issues. Instead of confiscating debts, they propose that the interest only be paid on debts, should be deducted from the principal and not from the payment. A lot of people seem to have gotten into debt thanks to the harsh the harsh conditions at the time, and that the rest of the principal, for the rest of it, 3 years, should be allowed. So extensions on loans, a kind of holiday from the interest rates. Not exactly forgiveness, but it's an attempt. The next sort of thing to do then was to try and produce some definite regulation on the distribution of public land. This would never quite go away as a problem, though, and would continue to haunt Rome for years to come, even after the Punic Wars, and especially after the Punic Wars, as we'll see, even into the time of Julius Caesar. A new military tribune the new military tribune with consular powers is done away with. It's seen that that's not fair, because again, it's only when the patricians decide to have it that it exists at all. So it's clearly not the sort of thing that it's equality in the eyes of everyone. So it's done away with, and the consuls are thereafter to be elected one plebeian and one patrician. So finally the plebeians can get into the highest office of the land, and this is considered, the Lakinian Laws are considered the third charter of Roman liberty. The patricians were still not quite ready to give up everything, though, and so judicial power was taken from the consuls and given to new officers called the praetor in 367, who still had to be patricians, but it was also provided that the two patrician aediles who policed the city came along to offset the plebeian aediles, so lesser magistrates. The patricians are trying to claw back some of that power, but after the passage of the Lakinian Laws, there were very few offices that still remained in the possession of the patricians. They were the dictatorship, the censorship, and the praetorship, and then the aedileship in charge of the police force. But it wasn't many years before they were all opened up to the plebeians. So in effect, this is the last gasp of the patricians to remain superior doesn't quite work out, and eventually, as I say, the equality is granted. Now, even though they are equal under law, being a patrician does afford someone a higher status in many respects, and they use that certainly to get themselves into the higher offices. So Julius Caesar was a patrician, for example, and so on and so forth. It's still a thing, it's still an important thing, but it's not as important as it used to be. The plebeians are not barred from the high offices or officially made unequal. As Rome is getting its business together at home, it's then threatened by something from abroad. Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great, was called in by the people of Tarentum to help against the Romans, who were beginning to make incursions into their territory. Pyrrhus had, remember, there are a lot of Greek city-states in Italy still at this point. They will eventually come under Roman control. They're not all yet. And the Tarentines wish to remain independent of Rome, so they call in Pyrrhus to help them. He has multiple successful battles against the Romans, but he loses so many of his forces in the process. He says, one more such victory and I'm undone. So this is the origin of the word Pyrrhic, the term Pyrrhic victory. This is around the middle, 275 BC is when these things happen. Pyrrhus tries to treat with the Romans. He says, right, I've defeated you. Let's get together and form a treaty and make peace and end all this. And the Romans say, no, we won't treat with you. You leave Italy, then we'll talk to you. This is the Roman way. They don't back down. They don't compromise. And eventually Pyrrhus gives up, or rather goes off to other affairs in Sicily to try and conquer some of the city-states there and the Carthaginians. And goes on to have a rather interesting political career of his own, separate from the Romans. But for the Romans, the fact that he leaves, to them, that's a great victory. Even though he's defeated them in battle, they've come back from that every time, rebuilt their armies, and he's gone now, and they're going to continue to consolidate Italy. But then they enter into a major global affair which will change Rome forever. And this involves the other burgeoning power at the time, Carthage, which is expanding into the Mediterranean and into Europe, into Spain as well. So shortly after the Pyrrhus of Epirus, in 264, Rome finds itself engaged in an intervention outside of Italy for the first time in Messana in Sicily. And it's complicated, but there were a number of Roman mercenaries, that is, people who had worked for Rome as mercenaries, called the Mamertini in Sicily, and they're coming under threat from the city-state of Syracuse, which is effectively a Greek city-state, ruled by a king. Syracuse is attacking them. They're divided over whether they should ask Rome for help or Carthage, and that they eventually choose Rome. And this will draw Rome into this conflict in a kind of police action, which they were actually against, because something similar had occurred when a Roman commander had illegally seized the Greek colony of Rhegium in the toe of Italy, and he got executed for this. Because the Romans, remember, they believe in the casus belli. There has to be a cause of war. War has to be just. Rome can't be the aggressor. They must be provoked by someone else. So, a proactive attack, unprovoked, is just not allowed. But the Romans were concerned that the Carthaginians were gaining a hold on Sicily, and if they did, the Italian mainland would be next. So after a lot of debate, they voted not to help the Mamertini in Messana, but then the Assembly takes a different line. And remember, they eventually get the power to veto other decisions. So they decide that an intervention is necessary, that Carthaginian incursions into Sicily amount to a provocation. Well, the Carthaginians were the masters of the sea. They had excellent ships. They were excellent sailors. The Romans were not. The Romans were much more skilled at land-based warfare. So what did they do? Well, Rome had to become a sea power, and we're told that they retro-engineered captured Carthaginian ships and used them as a kind of model. Now, what you're not told, or what Livy and some of the others don't inform you of, but modern historians are aware, is that because the Romans had no naval architects and engineers, they used people who were accustomed to building things like farm machinery to build these retro-engineered boats. And they used the wrong kind of wood, they used the wrong kind of material to seal up the planks. So these new ships were clunky, they didn't sail right, they leaked. But the Romans were still able to build more of them than the Carthaginians had. And the Romans adopt some interesting techniques as well to make naval warfare a little bit more like land-based warfare. They developed something called the corvus, which is a large gangplank with spikes on the end. And the idea is you sail the Roman ship up next to the Carthaginian ship. This gangplank with spikes is lowered rapidly onto the enemy ship. It sticks to it, and then Marines can run across and fight on the deck of the ship, much as they would on land. The Carthaginians counter this by just trying to stay away from the Roman ships as much as possible, and also the corvus turns out to be pretty destabilizing for Roman naval vessels. Ships often sink because they're heavy, clunky things on ships that aren't very well built to begin with, and so they then make an adaptation. So it's decided to use a ballista with a grappling hook, then to grapple an enemy ship and pull it close to the Roman ship, so that again the Marines can go across and fight. But in typical Roman fashion, they do this without changing the name. So the ballista with the grappling hook is also called the corvus, which means crow, same as the gangplank affair, as if to say, we never got it wrong. It was always like this, and this is how it works. Why the Romans didn't ask the Greeks for help in building ships is not clear, except perhaps many of the Greeks were hostile to Rome at that point. As I say, they do manage to build more ships than the Carthaginians, and they do eventually kick Carthage out of Sicily. Peace is imposed in 241. Carthage is made to withdraw from Sicily and to pay a huge indemnity as well. But Carthage doesn't think this is the end by any means. Carthage begins to expand even further into Spain. I should say the upshot of the First Punic War is that the Romans get Sicily. They will later claim Sardinia as well, although that wasn't part of the treaty, but they take it while the Carthaginians are busy. Anyway, Carthage is moving into Spain. Their mercenary general Hannibal Barca invades Italy in about 218 because Rome is seen as a threat, and vengeance is sought for the defeat of the First Punic War. The town of Saguntum in eastern Spain becomes the cause of war. This is a town allied with Rome. The Carthaginians take it, and then this provokes a declaration of war. And as I say, the Carthaginians decide to sort of preempt the Romans and just go ahead and march on Italy. So Hannibal famously marches towards Italy from Nova Carthago, New Spain, New Carthage in Spain, reportedly entering Gaul with 40,000 foot soldiers, 12,000 horsemen, and a corps of about 40 war elephants. He still has to cross the Pyrenees and the Alps with these, and the sources are unclear exactly where he does this or how he does it even, but he does manage to get across. He loses quite a few of his troops. He ends up on the other side with 38,000 infantry, only 8,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. So he did not major losses, but his numbers have been cut back a bit. He storms through Italy like a juggernaut, taking city after city, and virtually every family in Rome lost someone as a consequence of his attacks. He comes up right to the gates of Rome itself, and he wants them to surrender. Now he's done this so quickly. He's taken these towns one by one. He's not got men to hold them. So the Romans can and will take them back rather quickly. But for a time, he dominates Italy, comes to the very gates of Rome, demands they surrender. And his view of warfare is very much like the Greeks, very much like Pyrrhus of Epirus. That is, when the winner is clearly shown, both sides reach an agreement, a treaty is signed, and money is paid, and everybody goes home. The Romans, again, don't have this same attitude. So they're not going to give up. They hold out in Rome. Now, he could have potentially taken the city. For whatever reasons he doesn't. There are, of course, Roman armies in the field which were coming to relieve Rome. And Hannibal is very much aware that those cities he's already taken are probably going to fall very quickly back to the Romans. So his time is limited. Time is on the Roman side. They hold out long enough that he has to withdraw. But it scares them. Think about Cato the Elder and his dread of Carthage. He was 17 when Hannibal was at the gates. Hannibal would continue to frighten the Romans for many centuries long after he was dead. Mothers would frighten their children and say, behave, or Hannibal will get you. He was like a monster, a demon. As I say, though, he has to withdraw back to Spain, and then the Romans turn what becomes a war of defense into a war of conquest. They go after Sicily, and despite the cleverness of Archimedes, the scientist and his machines, they managed to take Sicily itself, Syracuse itself, which had maintained more or less independence, but technically allied with Rome. The king kept changing sides. The Romans had gotten the rest of Sicily from the First Punic War, but not Syracuse. Now they have Syracuse. And then in 209, Publius Cornelius Scipio captures Carthage's primary base in Spain, Nova Carthago. That's modern-day Cartagena, where the Spanish Navy still is largely located. And once the Carthaginians are rolled back in Spain, the Romans march on Africa. And the famous Battle of Zama takes place in 202, which earned the Roman commander Scipio the name Africanus. So we know him today as Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. The Romans successfully defeat the Carthaginians at this point, And thanks partly to the betrayal of one of their allies by the name of Massinissa, a Numidian general who had earlier assisted the Carthaginians in Iberia, he goes over to the Roman side, and the Carthaginians have little choice but to surrender. Carthage lost about 20,000 of its people, its troops, an additional 15,000 wounded. The Romans had much smaller numbers by contrast. This resulted in the loss of respect for Hannibal, and the conditions of the defeat were such that Carthage now was stripped of all of its overseas territories. They could no longer vie for Mediterranean supremacy. So all of Spain that they had conquered now goes to Rome. The Balearic Islands, Ibiza, places like that become Roman. Sicily, Sardinia, etc. Corsica. And interestingly enough, so as I say, Rome gets an empire at this point. It was already it was an empire state in the growing anyway in Italy, but now it's a proper empire. And the seeds, as it were planted for empire in other ways too. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus was such a successful and charismatic leader that in Spain, the locals, the aristocrats who were under control of the Carthaginians, when they're, as it were, liberated by Scipio, they want to hail him as their king, which is a bit embarrassing for a Roman of the Republican era when they had cast out their kings. He allows them to call him imperator, which in Latin simply means commander or supreme commander, but it's the word that will later be the same as emperor. Oh, I've got something as well I want to mention, which I should have said it earlier, but this sort of illustrates the kind of one of the differences between Romans and Carthaginians. So we have the rams, and you can see a picture of one here, the bronze rams that go on the front of these warships that ram into each other. And on one of the surviving Carthaginian ones, there's an inscription, because they like to put inscriptions on things they made. It says, "We pray to the god Baal that this ram will go into the enemy ship and make a big hole." So the prayer written on it to sink the enemy ship. On the Roman one, though, and I think this speaks volumes about the Romans, it says, "Lucius Quinctius, the son of Gaius, the quaestor, approved this ram." So it's got the official Roman stamp of approval. And that's how they thought. They were a very bureaucratic society. Law and order, structure, legality. And as I say, what's inscribed on the rams of these ships illustrates this superbly. So Carthage is defeated, stripped of virtually all of her holdings apart from her homeland. And that could have been the end of it, but as we saw in class last time, a certain faction within Rome, led by Cato the Elder, want to finish the job, and so we get the Third Punic War, spurred on by Cato, and they had repaid their debt, the indemnity for the war, by 151 BC. Which meant it was over and done. A line was drawn under it as far as the Carthaginians were concerned. Clearly the Romans had a different thought. And again, the Romans use a kind of pretext. Their allies, the Numidians, launch a border raid on the Carthaginians, and the Carthaginians defend themselves. But because they've attacked an ally of Rome, this allows Rome the pretext to go and, to make further demands for concession. So they make rather absurd demands to satisfy the Roman people. By pay, they want them to pay more money. They want the Carthaginians to take up their city and move it several miles inland, so that they're no longer a naval power. And this is just too much. The Carthaginians decide, that they're not going to kowtow to Rome anymore. So in 149 BC, Rome declares war. The Carthaginians make multiple attempts to appease them, but none of it works. And Rome, led by another Scipio Aemilianus, will attack the city. It takes them several years of siege to even at this point, in its much weakened state, to destroy Carthage, but they do. Scipio Aemilianus, descendant or part of the same family of, at any rate, I think he's adopted into the Scipio, the Cornelius family of Scipio Africanus, who's dead at this point. Scipio Aemilianus assaults the city. Though the natives fought bravely, they are defeated. The remaining 50,000 Carthaginians, which is only a small part of the original pre-war population, are taken into slavery. And that's effectively the end of that ethnic group of people. They're then dispersed throughout Roman territory as slaves. City is systematically burned for 17 days. The city walls and its buildings are utterly destroyed. And Carthage itself is annexed by Rome. It would become one of the richest Roman provinces because the soil there is extremely fertile. I think it is to this day. It's modern-day Tunisia, roughly. And it became Rome's breadbasket, and as I say, it would become one of the richest provinces of the empire. So there's an old Victorian lie that the Romans plowed the fields with salt. They didn't. As far as we know, no ancient source says this, and it would have been quite foolish for them to do so. So the upshot of the Punic Wars is that Rome now has an empire. It doesn't have an emperor yet, but you can have an empire without an emperor. An empire is when one sovereign state takes over other formerly sovereign states or territories and absorbs them into itself. Rome is now a proper empire state, challenging that of the Greek empires that have existed previously, and it will eventually absorb those empires. And, you know, as I say, in many ways the seeds are being laid for the rise of the imperial regime at this point. It has partly to do with the fierce competition amongst the aristocrats over high public office. The kind of end game of that competition is that you know, one person is going to win, and that person will eventually be Julius Caesar and later Augustus Caesar, who becomes the first emperor. So in many ways, it was beginning to happen already in the 2nd century BC, if not earlier. We should also bear in mind that while Rome extended its rule not only over all of Italy, eventually absorbing the Carthaginian Empire and the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, its government remained essentially that of a city-state. This is a recurring theme with empire states. The one exception kind of being Alexander's empire, as short-lived as it was. It doesn't seem to have fallen prey to this as badly because the capital was essentially where Alexander was. But Rome, the city-state of Rome, now governs and will govern a huge, vast, polyglot, you know, multinational territory. And this is an era in which, you know, telecommunications are not like they are today. So the rulers in Rome are going to be increasingly removed from the world that they govern. And they're always going to make decisions in the interest of Rome itself. And you can see how this is somewhat problematic because ultimately it still remains a city-state with its own self-interest. And its self-interest sort of almost, you know, narcissistically to an absurd degree, taken above and beyond everyone else's needs and interests. But we'll get to more of that in time. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing my class in the seminar and see the rest of you another time. Goodbye for now.